Courageous Conversations. I am here with you today from Organizational Learning on campus, and I am an organizational effectiveness consultant and educator with the University of Michigan, and I specialize in DEI, culture, leadership, communication, and learning. It is truly my privilege and pleasure to support individuals, teams, and departments on the Ann Arbor campus and at Michigan Medicine as they work to be more effective in their relationships, in their systems and structures, policies, practices, and anything else in their organizational efforts to create an awesome workplace. A culture where faculty and staff can thrive, can do their best work, and so that they can have a positive impact on patients and students and each other. So in order to have better relationships with patients and students and others, it's imperative that we know how to have courageous conversations. And in this session, we're going to consider some things like why conflict is actually good, how power dynamics can affect our communication and relationships, even our brief interactions, along with a few other principles behind successful, courageous conversations. Now, once we've explored those principles, we are going to spend a little time on the mechanics of holding a courageous conversation. I'm going to share a couple models with you that you could use to have your own courageous conversations. So our goals for today are to understand what a courageous conversation is and why I use that particular term, courageous. We're going to consider some principles that support successful, courageous conversations, and we're going to explore how to hold a courageous conversation. So first, let's talk a bit about what is a courageous conversation. A courageous conversation is a discussion that requires you to speak candidly, openly, and about topics that may be sensitive and or uncomfortable. Courageous conversations have the potential of creating strong emotions. So there's many definitions of courageous conversations out there. This is the one that I like the most. And so today, this is the one that we are using. Now, there's goals of courageous conversations, and some of those goals are to better understand each other, to validate people's feelings and experiences, to provide support, to create a psychologically brave environment, which we'll also talk about in a couple minutes, and to care for each other. Also, when a courageous conversation is successful, it can lead to greater knowledge, understanding, growth, and positive change. And we can always use positive change. Okay, so why do I use the word courageous instead of maybe you've heard of difficult conversations and crucial conversations? Those terms have been used and still are used to describe conversations where the discussion topics could be challenging and emotions could run high. Using those descriptors can actually set oneself up to be defensive, anticipating trouble and contention. And this is why I sort of try to stay away. When we are focused on self-protection, when our defenses are high, we're more likely to be distrustful. We're more likely to be looking out for just our own well-being. And in a courageous conversation, that actually doesn't set us up for good success. I like to use courageous to describe these conversations as it can help us to prepare to be vulnerable and authentic in the conversation, be willing to share our thoughts and feelings while being curious and respecting the thoughts and feelings of others. And in this courageous mindset, we are more likely to communicate to each other from a place of care and compassion, honoring the fact that all those involved in the discussion are working to talk about a difficult topic in a way that keeps the relationships intact, perhaps even betters them, and helps us move forward in some way. So that's a little bit about what courageous conversations are, the definitions and of how we're going to be using it today. With that, though, we're going to move to the next section because this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time today. And that is in the principles of a courageous conversation. So many of, if not most of us, have learned that conflict is inherently bad. Conflict is actually a really important concept and principle behind holding courageous conversations. But we likely associate conflict with discomfort, even hurt, since we may feel annoyed, angry, anxious, surprised, confused, defensive, uncomfortable in some way when we are faced with conflict. But I think conflict really gets a bad rap. One reason conflict gets a bad rap is that we do associate that conflict with those uncomfortable emotions. So, these uncomfortable emotions arise because our brain really likes sameness, patterns, agreement. And when we receive information that contradicts our currently held beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, we are likely to experience something called cognitive dissonance. Our brain is wired to see difference as danger. And so when we experience conflict and cognitive difference, our defenses and our emotions can rise. If we learned that conflict is inherently bad, we may avoid conflict at all cost, perhaps bottling things up until we just can't anymore, and then exploding in anger. Or maybe we learn to address conflict with lots of emotion and very little tools for managing it well. This leads to another reason why conflict gets a bad rap. Conflict gets a bad rap from the way it is handled poorly, negatively, inappropriately, hurtfully, or not at all. But the real problem there is not the conflict. It is the way in which the conflict is handled. Now, the truth is we will never be able to avoid all conflict. And we actually need conflict in order to learn and grow instead of avoiding the conflict. It would be better for us to learn skills that we need to resolve conflict and manage it well. Another aspect to conflict is what the program on intergroup relations calls the learning edge. And what you see on your screen now is a model with concentric circles. And in the middle circle, we have the comfort zone. In the next circle, we have the learning edge. And in the outer circle, we have the unsafe zone. There's also an arrow pointing to that middle circle that is called the learning edge. And there's a label there that says conflict. So the learning edge is also the place where we experience conflict and cognitive difference. So the challenge is to recognize when we are on the learning edge and then remain there through the discomfort to see what we can learn. The IGR group talks about using a rubber band as an analogy. And so they say the resting state of the rubber band is your comfort zone. So those are topics and discussions where you are really comfortable. You can talk about the weather. You might be able to talk about your favorite color, maybe even what you had for lunch. Those are easy topics, right? We don't have any trouble with those. But then we go into the learning edge. That's where the rubber band gets stretched. So the elasticity starts to move. That's what's represented in that. So if we think about our brain getting some different information, some new information, then it's stretching our ability to deal with that particular topic. Now, again, the goal is to go through that discomfort, right? But here's the thing, we want to make sure that we don't let the rubber band snap. And so that's what is represented by the unsafe zone. So there are topics that we're not ready to deal with. And maybe that's because of trauma, or maybe it's just because we're tired, or maybe we're not feeling well. For whatever reason, we're not ready to address the topics that are in our unsafe zone. Now, one of our goals could be, though, to prepare ourselves to address those topics and prepare to learn and grow. Because eventually what you can do is you can take topics that are currently in your unsafe zone, and by working with them, dealing with them, you can move them through the learning edge towards your comfort zone. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit more about that learning edge. When we are on the learning edge, we are most open to new knowledge and understanding, as well as, like I mentioned, expanding our comfort zone. So the learning edge is an important place to be. And we want to know that in the learning edge, where conflict and cognitive dissonance happens, that's normal. Okay? So this doesn't mean that all conflict is good. There's a masterclass article online that when I send you the slides after this session, I can provide the link to that article. But what they talk about in that article is the difference between positive conflict and negative conflict in the workplace. And they talk about those two things as it relates to their results. So if positive conflict is also known as healthy conflict, that occurs when people who are at odds exchange their differing views in a productive, constructive way. Each person acknowledges the difference that is coming from the other person, and they attempt to understand where the other person is coming from. In this type of conflict, a collaboration process leads to resolution. Then there's negative conflict. Negative conflict resolution, or unhealthy conflict, leaves the sides of the people who are in the conflict worse off than when they started. In negative conflict resolution, differing sides ignore each other's point of view and don't seek greater clarity or understanding. Instead of making a good faith attempt at problem solving, the parties of hostile conflict simply want to win, even if that means adverse outcomes for the other person or even the organization. And so we want to make sure that we are really trying our best to move towards positive conflict. Now, the last little part we're going to talk about with conflict is that Kenneth Thomas and Ralph Kilman developed a 5 conflict resolution strategy model strategies that people use to handle conflict. And each style is a function of how we focus on our own personal agenda and our relationships. Now, keep in mind that there's no best style. The Office of Conflict Resolution here at the University of Michigan on campus has developed a conflict card. And on that card are the 5 types of problem-solving strategies. The first type that we see is the competitor. And the competitor is, we're going to do it my way, and I want to win, right? You'll also notice that we have an X and Y axis on this picture. On the X axis, or the horizontal axis at the bottom, we want to focus on the relationships, right, with those styles. On the Y axis, we want to focus on the assertiveness, right? So when we look at the competitor, the one that we just talked about now, we can see that it is high assertiveness, but low in relationship, right? So that's how you can determine how that conversation might go if you are a competitor or if the person you're talking to is a competitor. The next one is collaborator. So how can we do this together? The collaborator is both high in assertiveness and in relationship. And so that's really a great place to be. Again, all of these have a place though. If we go to the bottom left corner, we see the word avoider. And so the avoider doesn't want to deal with conflict at all, right? And in that, we see that it is both low in relationship and low in assertiveness. To the right of that, there's accommodator. And so accommodators are really kind of more submissive when it comes to the outcomes of conflict. They just want to make sure the other person is okay. And so what you see there is they're high in relationship, but they're low in assertiveness. And then right there in the middle is the compromiser. And the compromiser uses a bit of everything, depending on the need of the situation. Again, there's no best one here. It all depends on the person and the situation, etc. So the next concept or principle we want to talk about is empathy and compassion. Recently, I learned that compassion is empathy plus action. And I had never heard it described that way before, but that made more clear the difference between those two words for me. So in courageous conversations, it's important for us to actually consider both of these. Our empathy is our feeling of awareness and desire to understand the emotions of others. Compassion is our emotional and even, physical response to empathy. And so it's an understanding of a person's feelings, but it's accompanied by a desire to act on that person's behalf. So when you see someone hurting, you relate to their situation and you want to help them. So that's a principle to keep always in mind when we are thinking about having a courageous conversation. Bravery is absolutely needed to hold a courageous conversation. You may have heard about the importance of psychological safety, but really safety is a very lofty and unrealistic aspiration. We can never guarantee that a situation is going to be safe, psychologically or otherwise. What we can all commit to doing, though, is to have brave spaces and to be brave ourselves. So what that entails is, feeling like we can share our views and then being brave enough to share them, being authentic and being able to share our experiences and how we think about things. A brave space creates an environment where we can move beyond our comfort zones to be authentic, to learn from each other and challenge ourselves in caring for each other in respectful ways. All right, moving on to the next principle, cultural humility. So we're going to watch a quick video here. Cultural humility, cultural competence, again, we will never arrive. There's way too much to know about people because everyone is so different and complex and beautiful in so many ways. And so I want to tell you a little bit of a story about how I had to learn cultural humility the hard way one time. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself. So when I grew up, we were very poor. My parents were not educated people. They hadn't graduated from high school even. But my mother, she was teaching us table manners. Okay, she learned table manners. And so she would say things like, we might be poor, but we're not going to be rude, things like that. So I grew up with table manners. Now, one of those table manners was that you do not chew with your mouth open. And so we would get in a lot of trouble if we were caught doing something like that. Okay, now let's fast forward to this time I worked with this colleague. This colleague chewed with her mouth open. And she snacked like all day. And so she always had a piece of candy or she was nibbling on chips or she walked, she was one of those eaters that just ate frequently, small amounts, but the frequency part is what really got me because I could hear her chewing, but worse than that, we worked right next to each other and I could see her chewing with her mouth closed. With her mouth open. I started to really dislike this person. I started to think, how in the world did this person get an education? She had a doctorate degree. How in the world did she get a doctorate degree when she can't even chew with her mouth closed, right? I started to think, all these negative things about this person. And gradually, I really started having trouble relating with her and working with her. And I was quite miserable. Now, I did do a good job of masking it, right? But I would go home every day so stressed out from holding it all in because I was avoiding conflict. Um, but later on, at some point, I finally, getting to know her just a little bit more over time, I finally realized one day, you know what? I wonder if it's me who's the problem. And so I started to ask her more questions about her family, and and it was appropriate in our relationship to do that. And she started sharing things with me, and some of the things that she shared were just so beautiful. And so I started to realize, here I've been holding this against this person, this silly little thing I've been holding against her, and yet and thinking about her family even, negatively. And yet there was so much that was beautiful about her. And so I came to that realization, and I changed the way that I viewed her. She didn't change anything. And over time, I did better at work. I enjoyed my work. I felt good about work, right? And it was all because I changed and got to know her and her culture and realized that my way of doing things was just one way, not necessarily the way. And so that's the important thing with cultural humility, is that we have to come to the place where we can recognize that other people's ways are just as valid and beautiful as ours in many cases. All right, so that's cultural humility. So along with cultural humility is something called humble inquiry. And so humble inquiry was developed by Edgar and Peter Schein. And it's the skill and the art of drawing someone out, asking questions to which you really don't know the answer. So we're not asking rhetorical questions. And in a way, trying to build the relationship based on curiosity and interest in the other person. And so it's a practice of genuine curiosity, humility, and non-judgmental listening. It's an ask and not tell method of communication. And so that's another principle that we can use in our courageous conversations. All right, next. The 4 positions of power. So power is a huge dynamic in all of our relationships, and even in a very brief interaction. So, for example, if you work at the hospital, it doesn't matter what your role is at the hospital. When you are with a patient, they see you as in a position of authority. They see you as though you have power over them, right? If you're a parent, you have power over your children, right? So power over can be used in certain times effectively and for the good. However, it's not ideal, and it can foster and escalate distress and anger, and it can actually shut down relationships. Power over is built on force, coercion, domination, control, and it uses fear largely to protect and hoard the power. Now, we can see this in heavy-handed managers, etc. And so power over is something that all of us do in some way or another. And you can see the list there of the different aspects of power, right? And if we look at that list, each one of us can find something that we do on that list. Now, power to and with are ideal, and they foster collaboration and relationship. Power to allows each person to maintain their own agency and acknowledge their unique potential to make a difference. It also means that I have the power to create something. I have the power to change myself. I have the power to do these things. So power to is not just maybe giving power to somebody else, which that's part of it, but it can also be the power to do something. So power with is a shared power, and that grows out of collaboration. It's built on respect, mutual support, influence, and empowerment. And this kind of power can actually build bridges with teams, and it leads to collective action and teamwork. The last column is a column that we're not going to talk about today very much. It's power within, and really that column talks about how you use power within yourself and how that might show up for others. So having the personal power to recognize and have a sense of your own capability and capacity. How do you hold courageous conversations? One of the models that we've used here at Michigan Medicine is the Clara method. And in the Clara method, you practice calm and center for yourself, right? Internally, before you engage in listening and in talking. Then you listen with an intent to understand. You affirm the principles or issues in what was said. You respond to the issues that were raised with authenticity, using, one of the things we talk about in many places is using I statements, right? I feel such and such when I heard this. You can also ask questions in this response area, and then you can add information to the conversation. This is where, after you seek to understand the other, hopefully they're going to take the time to seek to understand you as well. That's one model. Another model is called the Common Ground Framework. I'm sharing several models with you for a reason. It's because we're all different. And so one model might resonate with me, but another one might not. And one model I might even be familiar with and think, oh yeah, I've heard about that one before, I'm ready to try that one, where other might be brand new and I want to spend some more time getting to know it before I would try to put it into practice. So with that, our second model we're talking about is the Common Ground Framework. So who's going to be in the room with you? List each person like on a sheet of paper in your mind, and then think about how can you be generous to each of them, right? How can you validate them is the next step. And then how do you describe what you want to talk about in ways that both validate them, are generous, but also bring forth your authentic self, your how you think about things, how you want to deal with something, maybe how you're feeling about something. Okay, so that's another model. Then we have Oops, Ouch, Educate. And my friend Katie is in the room today. Katie comes from the state of Michigan. She's a new employee here at the University of Michigan. And she taught me this motto called Oops, Ouch, Educate, which is when you make a mistake, you can say, oops, perhaps I've said the wrong word. Perhaps I used the word handicap and I wanted to use the word ability, disability. So if I use that and I say, oops, I use the word handicap and I'm really trying not to use that word anymore, I'm going to commit to doing better, right? So that's one way. And the educate part is then to educate yourself. How can I make sure that I'm doing better, that I'm trying this, that I'm practicing using a new term? Ouch is when somebody else says something that it's offensive or it's harmful in some way, and you can say, ouch, when I heard the word handicap, it really made me feel like I was less than. I really prefer that you use the word ability and able-bodied. That would be better for me. So in that case, you're saying out, you're letting someone know how something affected you, and then you're telling them how they could do better for you in the future. Now, we're all different. And sometimes, one person wants to be referred to in one way and another person wants to be referred to in another way. And we just have to get used to learn as much as we can about people. Okay. All right. So the oops, ouch. Some guidelines to think about when you hold courageous conversations. First, seek to understand and not convince others. Speak your discomfort using I statements. Monitor your airtime. Don't interrupt or talk over others. Be conscious of your body language and word choice. Practice active listening. Challenge the idea and not the person. Assume good intentions. And check your biases and the story that you're telling yourself, sort of like what I had to do when I, was thinking about that colleague. What was the story I was telling myself about her? It ends up that story wasn't actually true, and I needed to change my story. All right, the tools to support courageous conversations. So we shared the models with you. You have the Clara model, you have the Common Ground framework to use, and then you have the Oops, Ouch, Educate. There are lots of other models that can show you how to hold courageous conversations if those three don't work for you. But that maybe gives you some place to start. Some tools now, and some of these tools are really based on the principles that we talked about too. So prepare, make a plan, set your intentions, ask questions using humble inquiry, practice cultural humility, show compassion, understand and address power dynamics, use conflict for good, know your own conflict style and respect the style of others. And finally, be brave, vulnerable, and authentic. Those are the tools that make up a courageous conversation. So when emotions are high, oftentimes with these courageous conversations, as we talked about earlier, our defenses go up. We're hearing new information, or we're hearing information that's different and we're not sure we like it, right? So the first thing to do when your emotions are high is to take slow, deep breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth, and try to exhale out longer than you inhale in. And that reduces the effects of the sympathetic nervous system, which causes stress and emotion, or which kicks in when we have high stress and emotion. We want to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, which is where it causes relaxation and digestion. And those slow breaths force our physical body to go towards that parasympathetic nervous system instead of the sympathetic one. And finally, the other thing that it keeps that the breathing does is it keeps oxygen flowing to the frontal lobe. Because what happens when our emotions get high is our frontal lobe sort of shuts down, and we end up going to our what we call reptilian brain. And that's where we're operating out of reaction and not logic, etc. So we want to make sure that we're working in the frontal lobe. Practice active listening skills. Again, check your assumptions and your attitude. Validate and acknowledge others. You don't have to agree with somebody to validate them, right? You can say something to the effect of, I hear you saying that you felt harmed when I said such and such, right? Commit to continuing through the discomfort to get to the other side of a courageous conversation. And with everyone, try to extend grace and goodwill. All right. The last thing that we can do, which is the most important thing that we can do to hold courageous conversations, is to practice. So even if we are, born natural communicators, we still need to practice the skills. And the good thing about any kind of communication is that they are skills. And you can learn to be a better communicator anytime with education, and then practice, practice, practice. I leave you with this saying today. Maya Angelou said, we do the best we can with what we know. And when we know better, we do better. And so with that, I wish you successful, courageous conversations and the ability to communicate well with those around you.